Empezaré por un ejemplo que me parece ilustrativo de los tiempos que se manejan en Washington y en la Ciudad de México. Platiqué hace unos días con una persona que fue funcionario del gobierno federal como por 1992. Incluso fue una de las personas que estuvo en la negociación del Tratado de Libre Comercio de América del Norte. Y me platicaban que en 1992 fue la primera vez que se habló de integrar los aeropuertos de San Diego y de Tijuana. Un tema que apenas veremos realizarse este año. Estamos hablando de 1992 al 2015. Esos son los tiempos de la Ciudad de México y de Washington. Si fueran los tiempos de la frontera los que se escucharan en las capitales, seguramente la realidad de este Cross Border Express sería mucho más, en tiempos mucho más cortos. Pero esa es la realidad que enfrentan las capitales. Las capitales se enfrentan a la agenda que tiene, pues, sí, un país, incluso en el caso del Senado mexicano, la agenda internacional, que es todavía un poco más dispersa, y rara vez entendemos los discursos de las regiones. Si estamos, por ejemplo, en el Senado de México y vemos que alguien llega a la tribuna y presenta un punto de acuerdo o alguna propuesta sobre su estado, como que se le ve raro, porque es un Senado nacional. Lo mismo pasa con la Cámara de Diputados. Y en esa lógica se pierde la importancia de la cotidianidad y de lo que vive el ciudadano todos los días. Los temas nacionales no deben ser otra cosa que el agregar las preocupaciones de todos los que representamos. Y esa parte es la que se ha olvidado mucho en la agenda. Por eso no prosperan agendas como la migratoria o las de derechos humanos o los temas de armas, porque son los temas que vive la gente, pero no viven las capitales, porque más las capitales son siempre los lugares más seguros. Ahora, ¿qué me parece que sí tenemos que lograr? Innovar en la frontera. Si bien hay como estos cambios tecnológicos y si hay esta apuesta por agilizar la vida o hasta, como comentaba el señor Duncan, por hacer la frontera menos relevante, también la realidad, insisto, es que hay que hacer una frontera mucho más humana. Y esa frontera mucho más humana pasa porque es increíble que en una relación de $1 millón por minuto no haya una mesa de alto nivel para hablar de migración. No haya tampoco el espacio para hablar de derechos humanos. No hayan los espacios para tratar los temas que le duelen a la gente. Que sí es bueno, sin duda sí, toda esta construcción de infraestructura ayuda, facilita la vida, pero hay grandes apuestas que están pendientes en la frontera y en las capitales. Los debates de seguridad que se dan en las capitales y muchas veces se dan en torno a las fronteras. Hace unos meses nosotros discutíamos en el Senado el cambio a la ley. Tuvimos que cambiar la ley para hacer como preaduana y esta premigración con Estados Unidos, porque para nosotros implicaba un cambio legal. Y fue un debate incluso ideológico. Los temas en las capitales no son a veces por la práctica, sino por una supuesta idea de soberanía que poco tiene que ver con lo que se vive en las fronteras. Si lo vemos, insisto, hablar de que nuestra zona fronteriza es la cuarta economía mundial, pues sí sería mucho más interesante que algunos de nuestros estados que están muy lejos del desarrollo aprendiéramos de cómo se volvió esta frontera, esta zona tan exitosa, y entonces empezáramos a compartir y a arriesgar un poco más en las políticas públicas que, insisto, deben dejar estas partes ideológicas a un lado y volverse asuntos que le resuelvan la vida a la gente. Si olvidamos que la política es para resolver problemas, y más en estos casos que son problemas comunes, nos tardamos de 1992 al 2015 en entender que se pueden fusionar dos aeropuertos muy importantes.
Did you have a thought, Mrs. De La Vega Foster, or?
Yes, definitely the borders, and having been born and grew up on the border, I watched how through my life it's gotten more and more and more complicated. When I was very young, nobody even had paper, your passport. It was very simple to come back and forth. And although the family or the educational or the work ties remain, crossing the border has become more and more difficult. And And I think we need to work on how we streamline our border crossings, because that has to do a lot with the relationship between the two countries. Border crossings in this region have gone down year through year through year, and that's not necessarily good. Does that mean there's less goods interchanged? Does that mean people are not going to the other side? So I think we need to study why they have been coming down, and we need to really work on streamlining the border crossings and making more use of the modern technologies. And I come back and forth, a lot every day. And the truth is, I think most agents are very good at doing their job. But once in a while, you can get an agent that probably had a bad day or something and humiliates you. And that story has been heard several times. Several times because we tend to talk about the negative stories. That's why I say I go back and forth every day, and it's 99.9% of the time it's very painless, no? But that 0.01% of the time that you're treated really bad impacts people. And we're talking about human development that does not contribute to human development in our region. And there needs to be a way to address that, as all other institutions in the US do, with accountability. No, that's the law enforcement, and in the US has accountability, and I think so we really need to work on that, understanding that there's a push for security and a push, but there's, I think, a technology that allows us to do it better. And I just hope the Washington and Mexico times that you were talking about don't apply to the project Mr. Duncan was talking about, and we can see it soon.
I think it really begins with an agreement around a common vision. No matter what the timeline, I think it would be helpful if we had a common vision. At least mine would be North American integration that is both economic in terms of financial movements in either direction, but also human. So we should facilitate in the most efficient manner the movements. For example, our interdiction on drugs create a tremendous amount of complexity in our financial system around financial controls. And I'm not saying that doesn't have a specific purpose, but if you had an overall vision of integration, you might view the cost and the benefits of a policy like that in a different way. Because once again, my vision would be you'll have movements both direction. As we know, the birth rate in Mexico is just slightly above replacement. The idea of any major movements of population, one way or the other, is probably not in the forecast. So it's no longer an immigration issue. To me, it's an economic competitiveness issue. It's how do we integrate to compete with the world, and taking advantage of our complementary and our comparative advantages within North America, and then make sure that regulations and political boundaries don't interfere, or if they do interfere, it's at the minimum. And so that would be my vision. But I think it begins with a common vision.
I'm in violent agreement with that vision.
Yeah.
I think that is the vision. I do think it's worth, I think the days, and I've heard many stories very similar to yours about what the border used to be like many years ago, that it was a very casual thing. That world's not coming back. And that's a shame, but that's just the way it is. I do think that, 9/11 was what it was. It was a terrible shock to us. And one of the reactions to 9/11 was the tightening up on the border. I do think that pendulum has now started to swing back in the other direction. I do think we are getting smarter. A long way to go yet, a lot of work to be done, but I do think we're getting smarter. We just, over in San Isidro, we just completed a project that I'm told has brought the wait times down from about 3 hours to about 30 minutes. One of the infrastructure projects I mentioned is this in Tijuana, where you're going to be parking your car on the U.S. side, where the airport system is overloaded, walking across a bridge pedestrian bridge, getting on an airplane in Tijuana and flying away. That's brilliant. And that's the kind of thing I think we need to do more of, and I think we are going to see more of, I hope.
I couldn't agree more or more strenuously with this idea of vision. I think it's really a key issue, and we're very grateful, I think, that you raise it. How can that vision, and you are both, Mrs. De La Vega Foster and Mr. Hunt, have contributed a lot of that vision locally here in the binational tri-state area. And how can that vision that we are generating here and really trying to pursue through the sports teams and the public-private partnerships and the activities with human capital development, how can that vision not only really resonate in Washington, in Mexico City, but how can that vision in regulatory terms and in legislative terms in the Senate and the Congress in Mexico and in the executive branch and in the US Congress, how can that vision really translate into a scenario where these crossings are easier for a larger group of people and not for such a small group? How can we sort of open this up? How can that vision play a role?
Well, I think part of it gets back to the perceptions I talked about at the beginning. Remember, whether it's the perception of the U.S. of Mexico or vice versa, we need to try to move that perception to a reality that's in line with a long-term vision. It probably starts at the border, because I think we've got the biggest gap there. But a negative perception of the border on the U.S. side becomes a negative perception of Mexico, which that interferes with adopting a vision that is in the best interest, both short, intermediate, and long term of both countries. So, and that gets back to us taking more ownership of trying to close that gap. At least we can do our part there. But ultimately, it'll be political leadership on both sides that says this is in our best interest, and we need to move in this direction. And then within that framework, everything begins to fall into place.
Yes, I think that really brings our conversation full circle and really highlights the need that all of us really are diplomats, not just in the traditional sense of the word, but diplomats for our region, for our communities locally in New Mexico, in Texas, in Chihuahua, and also nationally in Mexico City and Washington, D.C. as well. I think it's just about time for questions, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right, Mr. Moore? Okay, and we have a very highly technological setup here with something called Twitter, and I think I'm supposed to tap on these questions and present them to our distinguished panel. This is for excuse me, it says Mrs. Senadora Cuevas Barron and Mrs. De La Vega and Mr. Hunt. How do you feel about Donald Trump's opinions and motives for the U.S.? It's out of a hat, you know, it's just come on.
Probably not worth answering. I mean, in the sense that anybody that lives on the border